Hi and welcome to MicroStrategy. My name is Michael Hoffmann and I'm working as a Principal Sales Engineer for MicroStrategy Germany. In this video, I want to show you an approach how you can implement commenting processes on top of metric values, including the context of the metrics. And we want to achieve that we write back this comment, including the metric and the context, into a database so that we can use these comments afterwards for other scenarios in order to relate this context to other data. And for this approach, we use a new capability in MicroStrategy that MicroStrategy introduced last year called Dossier Transactions. Okay, let's take a look what you will cover. First, let's talk about MicroStrategy collaboration services. Maybe you ask yourself, okay, why is Michael talking about commenting processes on top of Dossier Transactions if MicroStrategy has already collaboration services available in the platform as a standard product component? And using collaboration services, you're able to comment your, let's say, analytics reports and dashboards and so on and so on. So why do we need here an additional approach? For this, let's take a look at what collaboration services is able to provide. Here we are in a MicroStrategy dossier. We are on a dossier page, and collaboration services is part of the product. You do not need to install anything or so. It's available out of the box, and you're able to comment let's say on top of your analytics solutions you already implemented, but the context is a dossier page. Okay, so I'm here in a dossier page, and if you click here on the collaboration icon, you can see I'm able to comment here related to this dossier page on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm able to start discussion groups, and I'm able to invite here other people that are then able to join here a collaboration group together with me in order to discuss the KPIs of the page. Okay, very important, if you place a comment here, you're able to include the chapter filter. This is the global filter that is part of the chapter filter panel, but moreover, if you personalize your dossier, if you use, let's say, filter criteria, if you use your selectors, or if you select a dedicated data context. So for example, I'm clicking here on a bar here, and then the data is updated here. You can save this context using so-called bookmarks. Yeah, and a bookmark is a context that saves everything you did on the dossier in order to personalize your individual context. Yeah, and you're able to share this context as well using collaboration services. So if you click here on share, you can see I'm able to share here this bookmark, including the complete context with other colleagues, recipients, and so on and so on. And this is part of collaboration services as well. So the question is, why does this not meet our requirements if we want to use commenting processes on top of metrics? Okay, the difference is collaboration services belongs to a dossier page and not a dedicated metric and the value and the context of the metric where this metric is calculated. So a metric value on its own is useless, but in combination with the context, so for example, the metric was aggregated, related to a date, related to a product group, or for example, related to a region. This is the context of the metric. And our intention is to implement a commenting process where we're able to comment really on metric values, including the context. And we want to write this back into a database. And from there, we can do anything with the comments. Okay, so we can do analytics on top of the comments. We can relate the comments to the context and the objects used for calculating the metrics in our context. So it provides a lot of use cases and, let's say, goes a little bit deeper than just collaboration services. You can implement your really own commenting processes with this approach. Okay, so the main topic for this presentation is then the commenting process on top of metric values. And as I already mentioned, we want to include the context of the metric calculation, and you want to use a feature called Dossier Transactions. Dossier Transactions is a feature that uses transaction services from MicroStrategy, and maybe you know this feature already because it was part of MicroStrategy documents, yeah, for many years. And we were able to implement workflows and write-back scenarios using transaction services in MicroStrategy documents. But now this capability is part of Dossiers. So we can use transaction services in combination with Dossiers. And this makes it very elegant and very nice to combine analytical capabilities and really good-looking Dossiers, very interactive Dossiers in combination with write-back scenarios. Okay. Let's talk about the concept. So how do we need to go on here in order to persist the metric context in a database? So if MicroStrategy is calculating a context, for example, in a grid or so, is aggregating metrics here related to other attributes and hierarchies and filter conditions and so on, and we want to comment this context, this means we need to persist this context into a database, because otherwise it's useless. We need to make sure that the comment is really related to a value that is persistent in a database table. Yeah? Otherwise, we do not have the real context between the comment and the metric and the calculation environment. Okay, so in other words, we need to think about how can we persist this metric context in a database in combination with the comments we want to place on a specific metric value. And therefore, we need to integrate a table in a database where we write back this data. Okay. And now MicroStrategy multi-source technology comes into place. So let's say MicroStrategy is working on top of a data warehouse. We are querying the data warehouse for our KPIs, but we want to set up commenting process where we write back data into a table, and maybe we do not have the option to create tables in a data warehouse to write back the comments related to the metric values. And in this situation, MicroStrategy multi-source technology is very nice, because with MicroStrategy multi-source, you can say, okay, I'm using a different database at the same time, but I put a semantic on top of all the database at the same time, and it looks like we would have only one single database. Yeah. So in other words, we can calculate our metrics and the context of the metrics based on the data warehouse, but we can push the comments and the metric context in another database, and we put it all together with MicroStrategy multi-source technology. Yeah. Maybe you don't need this, but you have the option. Yeah, if you have the option to put and push the comments, including the metric context, into a data warehouse, into a dedicated table in a data warehouse, that's fine. This is the best approach. And I will show you this option here in the demo in some minutes. Okay, so what options do we have using transaction services in Dossiers? Okay, so if you are familiar with MicroStrategy and you know transaction services from MicroStrategy documents, you know there are, let's say, 3 different options to use this. So you can configure transactions on top of grids. So you're able to enter data in cells in a grid and write back this data into a database. The other option is you use a free document layout. You use grouping in documents, and you put your controls into specific, let's say, positions on the document, and then the document creates data-driven many rows, yeah, and then these rows can be edited at the same time. Okay, so it's a kind of pixel-perfect approach based on documents, and it's data-driven, so you get as many rows and as many controls as you have data rows in your query. Okay, and the last approach, this is a very nice approach. It's the approach where you use a panel stack with panels, only a single panel stack or many panel stacks at the same time, and you position your controls just as you like, yeah, on the panel, and this gives you a high flexibility to implement your very individual, let's say, data entering scenarios. Okay, so 3 different options. I would say 2 of them are most popular: the grid and the panel stack scenario, where you have, let's say, a kind of dialogue or form where you put controls at specific locations and where you enter the data and then write back the data. So when we talk about dossiers, so what does dossiers have as options at the moment? At the moment, dossiers do only support grid transactions. Okay, so you need to use a new grid called Modern Grid in MicroStrategy, Dossiers. And in this Modern Grid, you're able to implement transactions. And it's very easy, it's very nice, it's much more comfortable compared to the, let's say, old style document-based transaction. You do not have to implement a transaction report. MicroStrategy is creating the SQL for you. It's very easy, and I show you how this can be implemented. But panel stacks and panels and the individual positioning of edit controls on a panel, this is not yet part of Dossier Transactions, but I think it will come in future releases of MicroStrategy. So in other words, for my approach, I will use the new Dossier Transactions in combination with the so-called Modern Grid. So we are using the grid in order to comment and to update the comments on our table related to the metric and the context of the metric calculation. All right. So what will I show you? I'll show you first how we can comment metric values with context on top of grids, as I mentioned, using the Modern Grid. Yeah, this is the, let's say, easy scenario. But then we will jump into a more challenging scenario. We want to comment metric values with context on top of graphs. So how can we achieve this? Because I just mentioned, okay, if you would like to write back data using dossiers, you need a grid. So how can we combine this with graphs? And I will show you a very nice approach how we can do this, because graphs in MicroStrategy are very agile, very interactive. And if a user clicks a value or an element in the graph, you can from there start and open a new window, let's say an information window, and there you have the option to enter the comment related to the point that you clicked in the graph. Very nice, and I'll show you how to implement this. Yeah, okay, and then let's now jump into the live demo. I will first show you the final, let's say, solution, okay, to show you how nice it is, and you can make it really good looking. This is the really cool approach, because you do not have to isolate this kind of commenting process from the rest of the dossier. You can inject these capabilities, very nice, very smart, very good looking, directly into the dossier. And this is really a powerful feature that only MicroStrategy is able to provide in this way. And I will show you first these 2 examples. So the example with the grid, the example of the graph. You can take a look how easy it is to comment using these different approaches. And then we will step in the implementation, and I'll show you the tricks how you can set this up. Here we are in the same dossier you saw before, but now we want to inject this approach into the dossier. We want to inject a grid that is able to provide the commenting capabilities. Okay, so as I mentioned before, a dossier can have many pages. Our dossier here has different pages too. So if I navigate to another page here, you can see this different one. And what we would like to achieve is here on the left side here in this area where you can see I'm in the mouse, we want to get rid of this area here. And here we want to inject a grid that is calculating metrics on top of a dedicated data context. And we want to combine this with commenting capabilities. Okay, so how can this look like? Here you can see we are on the same dossier page you saw before, but now you see that I injected a grid here in this area, and the grid is calculating a metric called revenue on top of the context, region, and category. It's just a technical example, so the business context is not relevant. Okay, just take a look at the technical example. And now we want to enter comments here related to this value, yeah, and the context. And the context is value calculated on the context, region, and category. Okay, so how can we do this? We just double click here in this area and say, okay, my comment. Now we have two options to save this. The first option is you can click this arrow here. The other option is you can hit Shift Enter onto your keyboard. Okay, so now I hit Shift Enter and now it's in the database. Okay, so next one, test, Shift Enter. Next one, comment 2, and I click on the arrow and now it's in the database. Okay, let's jump out of the dossier and let's get back into the same dossier just to make sure that the data is really there. Okay, I jump out of the dossier and we're going to go back. And you can see here, now we are back here in the dossier, and you can see the data is really in the database, and MicroStrategy queries the database, and you can see the comments here. Okay, so this is one option how to implement this. By the way, if you like, you can hit this button and then you get an overview of the complete table. This makes it a little bit more easy. Yeah? If you have many rows you would like to edit at the same time. Yeah, this is another option. Sometimes it makes sense to implement this kind of solution. And now let's jump into a more demanding scenario. So we are in the same dossier you saw before, and now I switch the page in the dossier, and now you can see instead of the grid, now we have a graph. And we have the same metric. We're using color coding, we're using thresholds here. Yeah, you see we have the categories, we have the region, and if I hover with the mouse over the cells, you can see the revenue, and we have color coding in the graph top of the revenue values. Yeah, if you take a look at the tooltip here, you see there is a comment field, but it's empty. Okay, so this is nice because you can inject the comments as a pop-up directly into your graphs. Yeah, and now the question is, how can we now edit the context? It's very easy. You just click on a cell, and then an info window comes up, and now we click here, and I say, okay, my comment, Shift Enter, and now the comment is written into the database. Okay, let's take a look at this one here. Okay, next comment. Okay, I click here on the arrow. It's written in the database. And now let's hover with the mouse over the first entry. And you can see the comment is now part of the tooltip. So we have really a live connection to the table where we write back the data from this process. Okay, if we hover over the next one, you see next comment. This was the comment that we entered in the second step. So this is the beauty of this approach. You can connect directly against the database where you write back the data, and you have the results immediately in other, let's say, controls or other visualizations if you like. And you're able to relate this data directly with other data context in your dossiers. Okay. By the way, you have the same cool feature as I showed you before on top of grids. If you like, you can maximize the visualization. And for example, now we would like to see here books Mid-Atlantic. Yeah, I make a click and you see here books Mid-Atlantic. Let's enter the content. Okay, cool. Yeah, very nice. Okay. Now it's written back into the database, and if we hover with the mouse, you see here the comment is already there. This is really a cool power feature, and as you might know, MicroStrategy visualizations are very powerful. So every visualization is interactive, and you can select a data point. You can drill in a graphical way through your visualizations. You can create a graphical matrix, based on any kind of visualization, and this leads to so many different visualization options that you're able now to combine with this commenting approach using Dossier Transactions. And now the question, how can we configure this? Okay, let's start easy. So in MicroStrategy, you work with visualizations, you work with data context, and we need to make sure that we persist the metric values and the context together with the comment into a database so that we have a robust commenting process. Okay, therefore, we need to make sure that we create the commenting table with exactly the right metrics, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. Okay, so if you are in a dossier and if you are creating visualizations, you use the metadata from MicroStrategy, a semantic graph. And here you can see an example. I'm using category region from the semantic graph and the revenue metric. And this is used for the scenario you saw before. And if we create a visualization here on top of these objects, we can ask MicroStrategy, please tell me about the SQL that you have generated in order to create this analytical context. And we need to grab this SQL. We need to use this SQL in order to create exactly the same metric values that we want to comment afterwards. Okay, so how can we get the SQL? It's so easy, it's so nice here in MicroStrategy, because every single visualization can tell you a story about the query context. And we just click here on this button and we click on query details. And here you can see, here is the SQL statement. This is the SQL statement that generated our data context. And we need to persist the data that is behind this SQL statement in a database before we can implement commenting on top of this. Okay, so we can copy it to clipboard. We just grab the SQL here, and then we have the first step of our process. So what is the next step? In the next step, we need to create a table in a database with the output of this query. Okay, so we take the SQL from MicroStrategy, and we use this SQL in order to create a table with exactly the same metric values. Okay, and here you can see an example. So I have already created this table called TS Regional Category Performance, and here you can see the columns that came from MicroStrategy. These columns came from the SQL statement that I copied from MicroStrategy. And then I use a SQL statement called create table as, and with create table as, and then afterwards the SQL statement from MicroStrategy, it's very easy to create the table here in your data warehouse that is related to the data in your data warehouse. And this table covers exactly, and this is important, exactly the same metrics, the same metric values, and the same context of calculating these metric values. This is important because we need to persist this, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to comment anything here on top of these metric values. Okay, the next step is, this is not enough. We need to do some additional things. So the first thing is we need to add columns for the comments. Okay, so here, for example, you can see I added at this table a column called revenue comment, and you can see here this was the comment we pushed down into this table using the approach before in the dossier. Okay, so this is easy. And one additional thing, we need to tell transaction services in dossier what is the row, what is the context we are referencing in order to write back the data. And therefore, I created an additional row, and I call this row ID. This is an auto increment row. You can use a serial data type in PostgreSQL to create this. And I added this column in addition to the table. And with that, I have a dedicated primary key for every single row in the column. And this column is important later to combine this with transaction services in Dossier, because you need to reference exactly the right row in which you would like to write back your comments. And now we jump into MicroStrategy, into the dossier authoring environment, and I show you how you can set up this transaction process in MicroStrategy dossier. So here we are on the page. As you remember, here on the left side, we have this modern grid that included transaction support. And now I click here on Edit. So now I'm in the edit mode of this dossier, and you can see here is this control. Here is this table. Okay, so if you take a look at the left side here to the data sets, you can see here I'm referencing the data from the table that we created before. Okay, so we have the category, the region, I have the profit comment, revenue comment, and so on and so on. And here are the metrics. Okay, here is one trick in this data set. As you can see, I derived here a metric, and this metric is derived from the attribute revenue comment with the max aggregate function. Why am I doing this? The reason is I want to place the commenting column to the right of the grid. Okay, because if you don't do this, yeah, attributes are on the left side, metrics are on the right side, and if you won't do this, then this column here would be here between category and revenue. Yeah, and I don't like this, and therefore I use this trick. So I created this derived metric with the max function. This is the trick, and then I'm able to position this where I like here on the grid. Okay, good. In the next step, we need to configure the transaction, and therefore we choose here a grid type called modern grid. This is important. Only the modern grid has these capabilities. And if you click here on the grids, you see MicroStrategy has three types of grid. It's a standard grid, it's a compound grid, and the modern grid. You need to choose the modern grid. Otherwise, you won't see this menu items here that are related to transactions. Okay, so you are not able to create a transaction. Okay, but now here we can do this. So I already covered the transaction, the configuration, and therefore we take a look at the edit. And how is this configured? It's so easy. The first step is you decide what kind of transaction would I like to have. Do we need an insert a data transaction, a delete data transaction, or just an update data transaction? In our situation, we just need the update data transaction because we already created the table with the correct metric calculation and the context in the database. We added the columns for the comments, so the data is already there, but without the comments, and therefore we just need to integrate the update capability. Next step is we select here in this part of the update data dialog, we select the table from the database that covers the metric values, the context, and the fields for the comments. Yeah, and from there, I select in my situation 2 columns, and this is very important. The first one is we need to select the column that is referencing the primary key of the row that is related to the comment and the metric value and the context of calculation of the metric value. Okay, so this is important. This is the reason why we had to create an additional column in this table with a primary key ID. Okay, and you can see here I'm selecting this ID here, and on the other hand, I'm selecting the corresponding ID that comes from the data set you see here to the left, that I'm using to visualize the data in my grid. So this is the correlation. Okay, so I'm referencing here the same table for the data you see in the table and for the data to push down in the table with the comments. Okay, so this is the trick. Okay, so you relate the row ID here from the table to the ID column that is part of the data set that is referenced in the same table. Okay, and then the easy part, we need to define what field is synchronized here with the process of writing back the data into the table. And in our scenario, it's the derived metric that I called enter your comments here. And here, this is the field in the database where we write back this data. Okay, let's take a look at the SQL And here you can see MicroStrategy generates the SQL out of the box for you. Okay, so here, this is important, this part. Here you can see that MicroStrategy creates the right relationship to the right row using the row ID that we generated before. This is the trick. Okay. Moreover, if you click here on after submission, you can configure some actions here. So for example, require confirmation before submission, or what shall you do after you've written down the data into the database, display message, and so on and so on. In my scenario here, I haven't checked anything. Okay, and with that, you're done. This is all you need. And then the transaction works, and then you can run it in library, and then it's all done, and it will work. And now we want to cover the more demanding scenarios. A scenario with the graph, where we want to comment on top of data points and correlations in the graph. We are in the same dossier as you saw before, but when we switch here to another page, you see we have this graph here. And yeah, unfortunately, transaction services can't be configured on top of graphs. So the transaction services work in combination with the modern grid, but not in combination with the graph. So what is the trick? If you click here on edit, you will see, I would say, 80% of the approach is the same that you saw before. So we have this data set here with a live connection to the table we generated in the database where we place the comments. Yeah, and the trick is now that we need an information window that is able to pop up if we select a data point. Yeah? And a data point is the correlation of category and region here related to the metric. And this context is then pushed to the information window. And in the information window, we can look up the ID from the row in the comments table, and then we can use this as the parameter for the transaction. So the last thing I need to show is, let's take a look at the information window. And by the way, the information window here, you can see select information window. The information window is selected here in this graph. The beauty of this approach is that MicroStrategy does everything for you. So pushing the context to the information window, you do not have the need to configure anything here. That's really cool. And if I click here on the information window, you can see here is the information window. And here in this information window, we have this modern grid. And here you can see we have the ability to edit the transaction and to take a look at the transaction and configure it in the same way you saw before. And this is the trick. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little journey together with me. And I hope you saw that MicroStrategy is really powerful in the combination of different platform capabilities in order to solve your very specific needs. In this scenario here, you saw how to combine typical analytical use cases where a user is working on top of dashboards, filtering data, visualize data, but then in combination with write-back scenarios that are injected directly into those dossiers. And this makes it very smart, very comfortable for the users to work, let's say, in both worlds. Consuming data, generating data, and then the generated data is related to the data you see in the dashboard, and this can be done all together with MicroStrategy. This was only one example of the amazing power MicroStrategy has to combine the platform capabilities into specific solutions. There is much more in MicroStrategy, and the beauty of MicroStrategy is that everything can be combined on the platform, and this makes it very comfortable to solve really demanding solutions and requirements. Thanks for watching. I wish you all the best. Bye.